The Battle of Blackwater was the single most pivotal moment in the War of the Five Kings. After this defeat, Stannis Baratheon limped home to Dragonstone in order to lick his wounds. Meanwhile, the newly minted Lannister-Tyrell alliance placed the Stark forces in an increasingly tenuous position. Moreover, the young wolf's woes would not end there, for at this critical junction of the war that had consumed all Westeros, Robb Stark's ill-advised decisions would come back to haunt him in the most bloody of ways.
You know what's a good decision, with minimal chance of haunting? Planting a tree. We've got an offer from a company who'll do just that for you and provide you or someone you choose with a worthy title. It's our sponsor, Established Titles. They sell small plots of land in Scotland, which are sought after because of a historic Scottish custom where landowners are referred to as lairds, or lords and ladies in English. But to protect these lands, a tree is planted with every order, and Established Titles supports charities like One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. So it's a fun and novel way to preserve the natural woodlands of Scotland while helping global reforestation efforts. You'll get at least 1 square foot of land in Scotland with a unique plot number and a certificate to prove it. This allows you to officially get Lord or Lady on your credit cards, plane tickets and more. You can also get maps to show your new estate, including the immensely detailed, hand-drawn 1611 map by John Speed, held by the National Library of Scotland. It makes a great last-minute gift, and they even have couple packs that come with adjoining plots of land. The first 200 plots bought via our link will all be put together within a few minutes of each other next to the Wizards and Warriors plot, so act fast to join our little union of forest territories. Check out their Black Friday sale for discounts. Plus, if you use our code WIZARDS, you'll get an extra 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/wizards to get yourself a title or give it as a gift and help support the channel.
In the previous episode, we've seen that Robb Stark sent Theon Greyjoy back to the Iron Islands to get the support of his father, but instead of securing his support, Theon joined with his father Balon and betrayed his former Stark wards by launching an invasion of the North. In this, Balon envisaged a three-pronged approach, ordering his brother Victarion to take Moat Cailin, his daughter Asha Greyjoy to seize Deepwood Motte, and Theon to raid the Stony Shore. These attacks were successful, and the North, unable to defend itself with most of its fighting men down south with Robb, was slowly bled dry. Theon, unhappy with his position of minor authority compared to his sister Asha, decided on his own initiative to attack Torrhen Square. This in turn drew out the majority of the garrison of Winterfell, allowing the Greyjoy prince to take Winterfell with little resistance, capturing both Rickon and Bran in the process and declaring himself to be the Prince of Winterfell. Theon then freed Reek from the dungeon, taking him into his service alongside Maester Luwin, who pleaded with him to show mercy and tolerance. This fell on deaf ears, however, as Bran and Rickon, with the aid of Osha, Hodor, Meera and Jojen Reed, escaped from the castle. Furious at his failure, Theon took the advice of Reek, killing 2 boys of similar age and stature and mounting their heads upon the castle walls. Meanwhile, Robb, having suffered a relatively severe wound whilst storming the crag, was being tended to by Jane Westerling, the daughter of the Lord of the Hold. However, word soon arrived that Theon Greyjoy, having taken Winterfell, had executed both Bran and Rickon, which was of course a ruse in order to establish the young Greyjoy's authority, but Robb was unaware of this. Grieving the loss of his brothers, the young wolf fell into the arms of Jane Westerling and took her maidenhead. Much like his father, Robb was a man driven by honor. Therefore, in order to ensure he had not dishonored her, Robb married Jane immediately, disavowing his previous betrothal agreement to the Freys. This infuriated the Frey contingent in his army, who withdrew their support and headed back towards the twins, with Black Walder Frey going so far as to threaten to kill Jane due to the disrespect to their house. After recovering from his wounds, Robb withdrew from Lannister territory. However, he was soon to learn that his mother's reaction to the supposed death of his brothers would be equally catastrophic to the Stark cause. Catelyn, heartbroken by the loss of her children, had visited the Kingslayer and come to an accord with him. In return for his freedom, Jaime was to be accompanied by Brienne of Tarth, who would exchange him for the safe return of her daughters Sansa and Arya from King's Landing. This move angered many of Robb's bannermen, in particular the patriarch of the Stark cadet branch, Rickard Karstark, as the Kingslayer had slain his two younger sons, Torhen and Eddard, at the Battle of the Camps in an attempt to reach the young wolf. Infuriated, the Lord of Karhold sent a contingent of his bannermen to recapture Jaime, but they failed in the attempt. Failing that, Rickard led a small group of Karstark men out to murder the captive Willem Lannister as a sort of twisted consolation prize. As a result, Rickard was arrested by Stark forces and incarcerated. Following the Karstark insurrection, Edmure further advised Robb to keep Rickard as a hostage in order to ensure the fealty of the Karstark warriors, particularly in the wake of the Freys returning to the Twins. Robb dismissed this advice, declaring Rickard to be a traitor and sentencing him to death, and following the advice of his father that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword, Robb personally beheaded his bannerman. Prior to his execution, Rickard made use of his last breath in order to curse his liege. Citing the blood ties between the Starks and Karstarks, he declared Robb to be a kinslayer, an ill omen for Robb's cause. While the Stark war effort was becoming increasingly troubled, the Lannister one was quickly rebounding. Although the Battle of the Fords had been a decisive Lannister defeat, it also afforded Tywin the opportunity to wheel his troops around and meet Stannis Baratheon in open combat outside King's Landing. Crushing the supposed rightful heir to the Iron Throne, Tywin simultaneously gained an immensely powerful ally in the Great House of Tyrell. To cement his alliance, the High Septon set aside King Joffrey's betrothal to Sansa Stark in favour of one to Margaery Tyrell. By way of comparison, when Robb arrived from the Westerlands with his newly betrothed Jane Westerling, his mother Catelyn bemoaned the fact that he had not married someone such as Margaery, who could bring a sizable force to the Stark cause. However, it was not all plain sailing for the Royalists, for through the combined efforts of an escaped Arya Stark and the faceless man, Jaqen H'ghar, the Stark prisoners at Harrenhal were freed. Harrenhal then fell under the control of Roose Bolton, which ostensibly was good for the Stark cause, but would soon prove to be anything but. Things would go from bad to worse for the Northerners, as their situation continued to deteriorate. Although they managed to free Castle Darry from Lannister occupation, it would fall to Gregor Clegane just 2 weeks later. After reclaiming this fort, the Mountain Who Rides was not in a forgiving mood and instead sacked the castle, killing the 8-year-old lord of the castle, Lyman Darry, and eliminating the male line of that house. The Mountain would not hold the castle for long either, for when Sir Helman Telhart laid siege to it, Gregor had to retreat, for he only had a token force under his command. Word soon arrived from Roose Bolton, who ordered Sir Helman to put the castle to the torch and slaughter all of the Lannister captives, under the pretense of acting under the orders of the King in the North. Telhart was then to join Robert Glover and Harrion Karstark with the remaining Karstarks at Harrenhal to aid the assault on Duskendale. Roose played up the unbridled fury of the leaders of this group, which made up some third of the Northerners' footmen, due to the occupation of Torrens Square and Deepwood Motte, as well as the execution of the patriarch of the Karstark family. In truth, Lord Bolton was deliberately sparing these men to act rashly, for at this point the ever-cunning Roose had begun to plot the demise of his own faction. The Northmen made their way through the Crownlands, pillaging the area on their way to Duskendale. Unfortunately for the respective leaders of the contingent, following on from the defeat of Stannis Baratheon at the Battle of Blackwater, the houses Tyrell and Lannister had combined their forces, making them the most numerically superior faction in the Seven Kingdoms. Tywin, now acting as Hand of the King to Joffrey I Baratheon, sent his most competent general, Lord Randall Tarly, at the head of a large army made up of men from both the Stormlands and the Reach in order to beat back the invading Northmen at Duskendale. Simultaneously, he sent Sir Gregor Clegane, along with a contingent of Kingsmen, to cut off their retreat along the King's Road, effectively ensnaring the unaware Northmen within the Crownlands. When the Northerners arrived, they were surprised by the size of the force now facing them. However, this did not kill their courage, and they resolved to fight. On the northern side, houses Cerwyn, Glover, Hornwood, Karstark and Talhart made up the bulk of the King in the North's army. On the opposing side, warriors from the houses Tarley, Laygood, Ambrose, Fossaway of Cider Hall and Fossaway of New Barrel made up the bulk. Randall Tarley's excellent strategic noose would ultimately win the Royalists the day, as he caught Robert Glover outside of Duskendale, pinning the Northmen to Blackwater Bay. The battle was ferocious in nature, being fought in the fields and farms surrounding Duskendale, and it was here that Helmund Talhart was killed while leading his men in the assault. As the battle continued, casualties on both sides began to mount, with as many as 1,000 Northmen falling around the fields of Duskendale, never to rise again. Robert, taking command of the battered force, began a hasty withdrawal to Harrenhal, only to run directly into Sir Gregor Clegane on the King's Road, who utterly shattered the army of the King in the North. Sir Gregor then took Robert Glover and Harrion Karstark as his prisoners, while his men hunted the stragglers. Although Robert was eventually exchanged for Martin Lannister, Harrion Karstark remained in captivity at Maidenpool. The northern foot, which made up some third of Robb's infantry, was utterly broken at Duskendale, severely diminishing Robb's chances of retaking the north, requiring him to turn to the Freys once more for support. When word reached Robb of the defeat at Duskendale, he was left at a loss as to why the reliable Glover and Talhart attacked the town to begin with, although at this stage he remained unaware of the treachery of the Boltons. The slain Northmen were buried in a common grave close to the sea, with naught more than a wooden sign stating "Here lie the wolves" to mark their passing, whereas the fallen royalists were buried in heroes' tombs beneath the septs of Duskendale. Robb's weariness at this stage in the war had finally begun to catch up with him. In an attempt to repair his relationship to the Freys, he convinced his uncle Edmure to marry one of Lord Walder's daughters in order to make up for the affront he committed when he married Jane Westerling. Jane was left at Riverrun, with the Blackfish being appointed as Warden of the Southern Marshes. Thereafter Robb marched north to the Twins, where Edmure was to marry Lady Rosalind Frey, thereby reviving the Stark-Frey alliance before pushing upwards to retake the north from the Greyjoys. Stopping at Old Stones along the way, Robb discussed matters of succession. Acknowledging the death of his brothers and the possibility of Lannister domination of the north through Sansa, Robb suggested acknowledging his bastard brother Jon as a true Stark, which his mother Catelyn vehemently disapproved of. At Hag's Mire, Robb sent Mage Mormont and Galbert Glover north to reach Howland Reed, whose Crannog men, still loyal to the Starks, would serve as guides through the Neck, allowing them to take the Ironborn unawares. At the same point, Catelyn, Edmure, Mage, Galbert, Jason Mallister, and Great John Umber were gathered in order to witness Robb's choice of successor, which was rumoured to be Jon Snow. Meanwhile, Vargo Hoat, a mercenary currently in the service of Lord Bolton, was growing anxious at the resurgence of Lannister power. He had previously been in the Lannisters' employ, but had betrayed them in favour of the Boltons, selling out Harrenhal in the process. Fearing what Lannister retribution might entail, when Sir Jaime Lannister and his escort Sir Brienne of Tarth were captured near Maidenpool, Vargo instructed one of his fellow brave companions, Zollo, to cut off Jaime's sword hand. However, when Roose received Jaime from the leader of the brave companions, he assured the Kingslayer that Vargo had been acting independently from Bolton orders. In return, Jaime assured Roose that he would not be held responsible for the injury which Vargo inflicted. Lord Bolton then released Jaime, sending him back to King's Landing, into the hands of his father Tywin. Thus, Roose became a full-on traitor to the Stark cause. Unaware of this, Robb called upon Roose Bolton to join him at the Twins, as the retaking of Moat Cailin from the Ironborn would require all the men the young wolf could muster. Marching northwards to join with his supposed liege lord, Roose dragged his feet, tarrying at the Trident, causing his rearguard to be mauled by Sir Gregor Clegane. Upon his arrival at the Twins, Grey Wind was immediately aggressive towards the Freys, leading to the direwolf being penned up. Soon after, Robb's men crossed the Green Fork to the eastern shore, where a few thousand Freys were encamped within the three great feasting areas, with the forces of the late Walder Frey setting up a perimeter wall of numerous wagons and carts to pin the Starks in. Robb attempted to make amends at the wedding feast by apologising for his rash actions to Lord Walder, who instead forced the young wolf to beg for forgiveness of his assembled daughters and granddaughters. Following on from this ordeal, at the behest of Catelyn Stark, Robb asked Lord Frey for food and wine in order to gain guest right. When Roose arrived at the Twins, bringing with him 500 horsemen and 3,000 infantrymen, he discussed the disaster that was the Battle of Duskendale with Robb, convincing the young king that the defeat was due to the foolishness of Robert Glover, and that Theon Greyjoy should be kept in the Dreadfort following the bastard Ramsay's reclamation of Winterfell. Catelyn, seated between Sir Rymond Frey and Lord Roose Bolton, remained uneasy, thinking, was there ever a wedding less joyful? Meanwhile, unbeknownst to all those gathered, the outlawed Sandor Clegane had brought Arya Stark to the Twins in order to hopefully gain some reward from the King in the North for her safe return. After the wedding, a feast for the Highborn was held in one of the castles, with a second bastard feast being held for the lesser nobles in the second castle, and the common soldiers celebrating in the feasting tents, with ale, mead and wine provided by the Freys flowing. A multitude of common songs were played at the feast, with Great John Umber bellowing out his own rendition of The Bear and the Maiden Fair, indicating that he was deep within his cups. Roose then toasted Lord Walder's grandsons, Big and Little Walder, who were now in the care of Ramsay Snow. Then, as was the custom, Edmure and Roslin departed the hall for the bedding custom. Unbeknownst to the Starks, the musicians at the wedding were actually sellswords and knights, who signalled the beginning of the massacre in a rendition of the Rains of Castamere. It all happened very quickly. Very few of the Northerners were even able to react, as most were butchered on the spot by the musicians' crossbows or by Frey knives. Soon after, Sir Rymond Frey, supplemented by the traitorous Boltons and Karstarks, slew Robb's personal guard, including Small John Umber, Daisy Mormont and Sir Wendell Manderly. Robb himself had been struck by multiple crossbow bolts at this stage, and stood in the centre of the hall in shock, with his mother Catelyn grabbing Lord Walder's Lackwit grandson Aegon and offering to trade his life for Robb's.
On my honour as a Tully, on my honour as a Stark, I will trade your boy's life for Robb's, a son for a son.
A son for a son? But that's a grandson, and he never was much use. In response, Roose Bolton strode forward and stabbed Robb in the heart, stating, "Jaime Lannister sends his regards." Catelyn then opened Aegon's neck, and in response, Sir Raymond Tully Frey slit her throat. Not all of the Northerners were killed, however, with the Great John, Patrick Mallister and Sir Mark Piper overwhelmed and taken captive. Meanwhile, Grey Wind was killed in his pen from a number of crossbow bolts. In the camp on the eastern bank, the 3 feast tents collapsed and were set alight with fire arrows, having been oiled earlier in the night. As the intoxicated Northerners burned underneath the tarpaulin of the tents, Walder Rivers led a contingent of heavily armoured Frey men-at-arms against the Stark loyalists. Sandor fought off 3 men attempting to capture Arya, before escaping with the girl still safely in his care. Although the casualties were never definitive, Robb lost most of his soldiers that night, while the Freys lost a mere 50 men in the slaughter. Robb's body was decapitated, and vengeful Frey soldiers had Grey Wind's head sewn upon his body with a crown nailed to it. To add further insult to injury, Catelyn's body was thrown into the river entirely naked as a harsh mockery of House Tully's funeral customs. Through the grim and underhanded slaughter, the Northern Rebellion was effectively ended. Roose Bolton was named Warden of the North, and House Frey was given the Lordship of Riverrun, at the cost of their honour, for they had violated the ancient guest right. Explain to me why it is more noble to kill 10,000 men in battle than a dozen at dinner. Through the Red Wedding, the Lannisters gained a number of valuable prisoners, which helped relieve hostilities around Westeros, with most river lords swearing fealty to King Joffrey. With Edmure Tully captive, Sir Jaime Lannister was able to negotiate a peaceful resolution to the siege of Riverrun. Meanwhile, Black Walder Frey threatened to hang Patrick Mallister outside his father's castle, which resulted in Lord Jason's surrender at the Siege of Seagard. Moreover, Great John Umber and Sir Mark Piper were held as hostages to ensure their house's loyalty to the Boltons, the new overlords in the north. However, despite having ostensibly triumphed over all their enemies, trouble and tragedy was in the forecast for the House of Lannister, as the eldest of Cersei's children was soon to meet his end, triggering a set of events which would ultimately undermine their dominance over the Seven Kingdoms.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Established Titles. Buy a small plot of land in Scotland and become a lady or a lord, or give this title as an amazing and easy gift. In return, Established Titles plants a tree to protect the pristine forests of our planet. Take advantage of their early Black Friday sale and use our discount code WIZARDS at establishedtitles.com/wizards to get a further 10% off.
This series will continue in the coming weeks, and we're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing, as it helps immensely. And don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future.